Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webcast. Before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple applications which you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available one day after the webcast using the same audience link to join today's event. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list widget, indicated by the green file icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during this session, you can click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. You can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow help widget. That's a question mark icon that covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command R on Macs. We will use the group chat feature, which is represented by the blue chat icon during the presentation as we take pause for think time. You will also be asked to respond in the group chat. Your responses are not associated by your name or your organization. We will also take pauses throughout the presentation for poll questions. There will be poll questions displayed directly on your screen. Finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll be asking you to take a quick survey to gather your feedback about this webinar. Now I'd like to introduce Lauren Murphy of Mathematica. Lauren, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Lauren Murphy, a researcher at Mathematica, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Annie Bonacina, as well as two staff from two grantees, PATH and the RID project. And we'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar focuses on building a learning culture for continuous quality improvement, CQI. As always, we hope it will be an interactive webinar. This is the fifth webinar in a series of planned webinars that will occur through the year to help introduce SRAE grantees to a range of data capacity and evaluation topics. This webinar builds upon our June 30th webinar, which introduced terms and the processes of CQI, and our July 21st webinar, in which we discussed measures in CQI. Today, we hope to give you some insight on how to build a learning culture to engage in program improvement. These webinars are being planned as part of the SRAE National Evaluation. The recording from today's webinar will be available for viewing in a few days. We will also upload the slides from today's webinar to the SRAE website. The recording and slides from the previous webinars I noted are also available on the SRAE website. This work is occurring as part of the contract held by Mathematica and its subcontractor Public Strategies for the SRAE National Evaluation. The content we'll cover during today's webinar does not necessarily reflect HHS policy or requirements, and any commercially available tools mentioned today do not imply endorsement by the U.S. government. As I mentioned earlier, I hope we have an interactive webinar. There are 4 different ways in which we'll ask for some participation during today's presentation. First, we'll pause throughout the presentation to allow for some thinking time and reflection. Next, we'll ask you to respond to some poll questions, which will pop up on your screen. Also, we have a group chat feature where we'll ask you to share some of your reflections today. And finally, we'll respond to questions that come in through our Q&A widget. We do ask if you have technical difficulties to please post those in the Q&A widget rather than the chat box so that we can find and address those quickly. Let's go over our learning objectives for the day. By the end of the presentation, we want you to be familiar with what it means to have a learning culture. We will also want you to learn from 2 SRAE grantees about how they developed a learning culture. And lastly, we intend for you to be familiar with the supports needed to create a learning culture. We hope that you find any activities discussed today helpful in your work, but want to note they are optional and you are not required to use them. So we'll start today by discussing what is a learning culture before we pause to hear from our grantee presenters about how they have developed a learning culture in their organizations. So to get everyone started and on the same page in discussing a learning culture, we want to hear from you as to how you would define learning culture. So once again, we want to pause for some reflection, and using the group chat widget, we would like you to respond to 2 questions. Can you let us know, what do you think it means to foster a learning culture, and what might it look like in your program? So I'll pause and give everyone a few moments to reflect on those questions, and then you can share your responses in the group chat widget. It looks like we have some responses coming in. It looks like a lot of them are student focused, which I think is more about a learning culture within programming. Always asking questions. Yes, that is a big one. Using data to make decisions. Yes, definitely data-driven decisions are a part of it. Open-mindedness to new ideas. I like that one. Sharing knowledge. I see that we have some people using the Q&A widget as well, which is fine, but so that way everyone can see your responses. Do remember that the Q&A widget, asking questions and using the group chat, that way other attendees can see your answer. But I see we have continuous learning as well, and learning from mistakes. That is one. Great. So you can keep on. Feel free to keep answering in the group chat, but we'll go on and talk a little bit more about what a learning culture is. So I want to thank everyone for your thoughts. But before we really dive into what a learning culture can look like and how to foster one, we want to start with why it's important to have a learning culture. And we've had prior webinars which were focused on CQI and developing logic models to support performance management. But to be able to do these things effectively and to support evaluation of your program, you need to have the right conditions in place. So as we show here, monitoring and evaluation processes, including the CQI as one of the processes, can lead to overall program improvement. But in order to do all these things, you need to foster a learning culture in your program. A learning culture creates the conditions for performance management, CQI, and evaluation to be successful, and therefore can lead to improved program. So really this idea of the learning culture kind of supports these other processes in place which you use then to improve your program. So there are definitely some great examples of what a learning culture looks like in your program and how to foster it. And it seems like there's definitely some agreement among the group on that. But here's what we're bringing of what a learning culture can look like. So first, you want to have a strong performance management process. This means you're using your logic model to identify the outcomes that are priority to your program. And you're setting the expectation with your team that you're interested in tracking these outcomes. And you're not just tracking outcomes for performance measure or for reporting purposes, just for accountability, but you want to learn if your program is hitting benchmarks you set. You're trying to learn from the data. Next, if you're learning that you're not meeting your goals and benchmarks, you have a strong CQI process to improve on these challenges. These are the processes and tools we've discussed in the previous 2 webinars, such as engaging in learning cycles to investigate and define the challenges. Then you're working with your team and staff to develop strategies for improvement. You're collecting data from multiple sources to test the effectiveness of these strategies. And as needed, you are making refinements to improve upon the strategies. And remember, this is a cycle. It's an iterative learning process. Also, within a learning culture, experimentation is encouraged. I think someone said learning from failure, and it's okay. And you want to encourage an okay to fail culture that supports suggestions for improvement, and that it's okay that the suggestions may fail, because that generates learning. You just fail quickly, you learn from it, and then you move on and test out the next strategy for improvement. So it's okay to fail, just move on and learn from it. I think someone also talked about learning from data and making data-driven decisions. So programs with a learning culture have developed strong data systems. These systems allow for tracking high-quality data to be used for performance management, CQI, and evaluation. But it's not enough to have a strong system. The data also needs to be accessible to the staff. There are many ways to share data with your staff and encourage its use, such as reports or dashboards. And in a few moments, we'll hear from staff at PATH and the RIDGE project, and they'll touch on how they share data with their teams. The grantees will also discuss how they involve their staff. In a learning culture, you are actively engaging staff at all levels. You want to learn from different perspectives and encourage suggestions for improvement across the board. You may also want to include participants and/or their families or other stakeholders, such as community partners, in this learning process. And of course, in a learning culture, there is an emphasis on learning. And this can be done in a manner of ways. First, learn from others. What does research say about what you can do to improve your program? What have others in the field done successfully? You should also learn from your past experiences. Make sure you document the things that work well, but also the things that failed, and maybe explanations why, so you can build upon that. Also, you want to transfer the knowledge. You might want to share lessons learned from each other and maybe use what you've learned to inform staff development to help foster the learning culture. Now that we've heard what a learning culture is and its importance for improvement work, we'd like to learn how strongly does your program currently incorporate a learning culture. And you should have a poll pop up on your screen. And so using the options of not at all strong, somewhat strong, strong or very strong, please respond to how strongly does your program currently incorporate a learning culture. And I'm just going to pause here and give everyone a moment to reflect upon that and respond to our poll. All right. Finish up responding, push out the results, let's see what everyone has to say. All right. So it seems like the majority say somewhat strong, strong. Some of you are saying about 18% said very strong. About 6% said not strong at all. So it seems like there's a wide range, but most of you falling within that somewhat strong to strong. And for those of you who feel like you can strengthen the learning culture in your program, we hope you'll get some insight from the peer organizations about what they've done to build a culture of learning in their programs. First, we'll hear from the PATH team with Donna Golub and Harry Petrosky. And after that, we'll hear from Kathy Tirina and Vanessa Ridley from the RIDGE project. And then later in the webinar, Annie Buonasina from Mathematica will also speak to a few additional best practices. I'd now like to pass the presentation over to the PATH team. Donna and Harry, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much. So as she said, I'm Donna Golub with a Positive Approach to Teen Health, PATH, and Harry Piotrowski is our lead investigator with IT Mesa, and he'll be sharing with you in just a few minutes. PATH is a grassroots nonprofit organization with 16 full-time team members. We are currently serving 20 different school districts as well as associations with Boys and Girls Club and Lake and Porter County Juvenile Detention Centers. We are located in Northwest Indiana, and we have the opportunity right now to hold several grants, including a competitive prep SRAE, as well as an OPA TPP grant. So we are really busy. We reach approximately 5,000 students in a 7-county area, as I said, in Northwest Indiana. We're going to take just a few minutes to share with you how our organization does CQI. We believe that reaching youth with programming requires a team effort, and we work very purposefully to build our team. Every decision made regarding programming is discussed with our team lead and often with the full project staff. It is important to not only have buy-in from the front line, but to have their input and planning the CQI process. They are working most closely with the students, and they know what is landing well, and they also know what's falling flat. They see how engaged students are in the classroom. They're able to answer questions that those of us who are not in the classroom could only make assumptions about. They understand the engagement. They understand the interruptions that occur in a classroom, whether it's a fire drill or announcements or whatever it is. There's always something going on that can trigger different scenarios happening in the classroom. So it's really important that we include them in the conversation when we're looking at our outcomes. We also believe that it's really important to become true partners with our schools that we serve. We're not just there to provide a program, but we're there to be part of their community. We often volunteer at other events such as health fairs, parent nights, summer activities that they may do. And we also offer an annual conference where we really encourage our school collaborative partners to participate. And when we think about the topics that we're bringing to that annual conference, we often do so with our school partners in mind. So teachers often will comment to us that students are much more behaved and much more engaged in our programming than they are in their classes. And they have often commented on the way that we do classroom management. So we've also now added some professional development opportunities to the schools around classroom management styles. So that's kind of who we are and what we do. And why does that matter? It matters because this full team working together is what allows our program to either succeed or fail for our students. Having the buy-in of not only our team members, but of our community partners and the school faculty that we serve, getting their input and their needs is really key to the whole process of what we do. Communication is at the very top of our list. And most importantly is finding a method that works. In some of our schools, we know we can shoot an email out to our classroom teacher or our school counselor liaison, and we know it's coming right back to us. Others, it may sit in their email box for days or weeks, and we may not get a response. For those, we know we need to call and leave a message or we need to text them. So it's really important that you know how to best communicate. And the only way you're really going to know that is to ask the question, how would you like us to communicate with you? And then we hold regularly scheduled meetings. We meet weekly with our facilitators and project director. We have monthly full team meetings where we meet with our frontline staff, our team leads, and our project director. And then we have regular ongoing meetings that include our evaluation team of IT Mesa. The other thing that's important in communication is accountability. It's really important that we know what's working and what's not working. It's important that we know where the problems are, what's happening, how can we be supportive of one another. So at sometimes, not only do we have program staff meetings, but we have full staff meetings where facilitators from other programs can share with one another some things that are happening and how they're resolving situations. The other area of communication is how can we make a difference? How can we improve what's going on? And again, that's where our full team meetings really play out very well. There's no assumptions being made on what's working and what's not. And the frontline staff really get to encourage one another. Harry's going to share now for just a few minutes about his 3 black box concept. Harry?
Thank you, Donna. Just a bit of background. Because of my training and experience over a few decades in statistics, in educational theory, and in behavior change, much of what I do as the director for the evaluation is more than talking numbers only. And I think that's a key part of how we define the CQI process. IT MESA is probably the facilitator and the primary facilitator in the CQI process when it's a formal activity, and Donna, the project director, is probably the facilitator or the primary organizer for the weekly ongoing staff meetings. So what I'm presenting here is a core concept that's critical for the facilitators and educators to appreciate, because from my perspective, they are the ones who are providing the instructions. And they provide feedback about the curriculum implementation, both at the weekly meetings, which are more informal, and the formal month or yearly or several times a year meetings. And they add meaning to measures of student experience. So at the beginning of the project, I demonstrate how the curriculum as implemented is the responsibility of the facilitators. They have the knowledge and recent training added, and experience and the perspective and the responsibility, I can't say that too often, for that first box, for the instruction. But then there's a second box that we try to impact or understand the impact by the facilitators, and that's the student ecological environment and the curriculum as experience. So the students participate, they engage, their attitudes, opinions, knowledge, skills, and intentions are being acknowledged, recognized, and hopefully thought of and experienced and brought to surface by the student because of the instruction. And the third box is the outcome of implementation, the student experience. Ultimately, it's the impact, but for most of our projects, it's the outcome. So through all of our formal discussions, we focus on the facilitator instruction, how that results on the implementation, and what are the measures, and then how that ends up affecting the outcomes. So those are the 3 boxes that we talk about, and the core concept is that the facilitators provide feedback about instruction implementation and the student experience. And this process is repeated over and over again. So the facilitators, educators are the core, not the data, because the facilitators comment, review, they really analyze from their perspective the value of the data. Facilitators say, Harry, that graph doesn't make any sense. Let's look at it this way, or here's the problem, or they'll go to Michelle and say, you know, the data we submitted on such and such a school doesn't appear to match this. Do we have an error in coding, transmission? So they're the ones that really drive the discussion, the content, and the director, program coordinator, is the one who looks at the theory, the curriculum as intended, and the evaluation team looks at the measures of implementation and the outcome, and we both listen very carefully to the facilitators. So the facilitators are regarded as our core. Next slide. So there's a 2-day session. We present the black box. We review the logic model, evaluation design, the CQI design, the theoretical model. We have handouts. We even review a couple research studies that are distributed ahead of time for them to read. And we actually review some studies throughout the year. For example, we reviewed a study at our last session, which focused on development of a tool on mentoring, which holds some promise for the general field of peer mentor-mentee relationship, and looks like it's applicable to our program. So there was a lot of discussion of that article in the context of what data can be provided, what information are we not getting, how this could help us. So I bring in some research studies periodically. And then we review measures to assess the facilitator instruction and the implementation, and then ultimately try to link it with student experiences, their observations, and their outcomes. And then the next slide. So at the end of the year, where we kind of hold a 2-day more formal feedback, it's qualitative and quantitative, with facilitator observations, which includes the observations, independent observations, facilitator observations, their checklists, student data, student responses to open-ended questions, pre-post surveys. So we try to link, as evaluators, we try to link the session's activities to subgroups, and we try to target the objectives and examine how well the objectives that we started off with were attained. The objectives are presented early on with the director, and they're formally presented again at the first 2-day pre-session. So we come back to that and say, okay, here's our objectives. How did we do overall? After several reviews or several circles of going through the process throughout the year. So we interpret and provide meaning and validate the quantitative results. Now the validation is both a quantitative aspect, but it's also a big qualitative aspect with the facilitators, who sometimes are surprised by the results, and sometimes the evaluator is surprised by the facilitator comments. So my perspective, the more surprises, the better, because that leads to ultimately new questions, better understanding. So we explore these questions and tweak the tool to better understand how the process is proceeding. I think what we try to do in the CQI process is learn from the discussion and try to improve the instruction, the student experience, and the program outcomes. And each of the team members with evaluation has sort of a primary responsibility over one of those, but we all have a responsibility for linking the three, and we all recognize that. We all speak with equal voice, with equal authority, and we hopefully don't all speak at the same time at our meetings. So that kind of summarizes the CQI process. So it's up to Donna now.
Thank you, Harry. I think you've heard loud and clear between Harry and I that teamwork is very important in the way that we do our CQI. One of the professional development pieces that I offer to schools is, yes, there is an I in teamwork. And that is because if each of us individually don't bring our best to the table, if we're not willing to bring our voices to the conversation, then there's going to be something missing. So you often hear there is no I in teamwork, but I kind of give a little pushback to that concept. I do believe that there is an I in teamwork, and that I is us bringing our very best to the table. I just wanted to end our portion of this little conversation with this quote. A team is a small number of people with complementary skills committed to a common purpose, performance, goals, and approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. And I want to just take this moment to thank Harry publicly for teaching PATH how to be that kind of a team when it comes to evaluation. When I first started this project and with Harry, I suppose it's been almost 15 years ago now, I had never done any kind of rigorous or formal evaluation, and he has been a great teacher and mentor. And I hope that each of you have that kind of a relationship with your mentor, with your evaluation team. And if you don't, I would strongly encourage you to work towards that end. The program that we have through the SRAE funding is the Relentless Cross-Age Peer-to-Peer Solution mentoring program. We're working with 9th grade students mentored by upperclassmen. So we train upperclassmen to work with freshmen, and it is it started as a full year program, but thanks to COVID, we have taken it down to 2 semesters. So we've reduced the size of the program for this year because that's just pretty much the way it has to be. You can see our contact information is there. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to us, please feel free to do so. At this time, I would like to introduce you to Catherine Terrarini and Vanessa Ridley with the Ridge Project.
Thank you, Donna. What a great presentation by you, Donna and Harry. That was a lot of great information, and I love it because I love some more CQI, which sounds crazy, but I'm Catherine Tiarina, and I'm the co-founder, co-executive director of the Ridge Project, and I'll be presenting today with Vanessa Ridley, who is our Deputy Director of Research and Development. And so here at the Ridge Project, everything we do, we incorporate CQI. And so we have an SRAE project, we have a Title V SRAE project, we also have an OFA funded project, DOL, DOJ, and then some foundations. So we have all of these different projects going on. So we really look at CQI individually by the project, but also corporately to make sure that we're staying on mission because we're super passionate about transforming lives and building a legacy of strong families. And so we always want to make sure, we always go back and say, okay, what are we doing? What's the outcome? How is this impacting and moving it forward so that we're really bringing transformation to people's lives that aligns with our mission? And so everything we do is centered around that. We've really evolved our CQI process, which we'll talk more about in our presentation. But basically, we use the 6E. Yeah, 6E. CQI is 6E, right? So it's empowering. It provides information back to our staff, to our key stakeholders. That includes, schools, our partners, our health departments, our funders, our legislators. Anyone who's interested in knowing what is happening, how is this investment, what's the return on that investment, and it really it empowers us to know, hey, this is really what we're accomplishing. It's effective because it helps us build stronger and better programs for lasting impact. We can quickly identify things that maybe aren't working the way we thought they would work, and we can adjust those things quickly. And it's really engaging because we engage all of our staff. We bring our staff to our entire process. And so we've got staff from frontline staff to administrative staff to executive staff. and key stakeholders, where we gather the information, and it really builds camaraderie, partnership, a singleness of vision, and produces encouragement, because we really look at CQI as looking at it from an optimistic vantage point to say, you know what, we are going to do our absolute best in what we think is the right thing, and then we're going to test it, and we're going to figure out whether or not it works. So even, I love those answers at the very beginning poll that, yeah, you like learning from our mistakes, because a lot of our learning, how we continue to get better, is seeing what doesn't work and figuring that out quickly so that we can make the adjustment, so that we make sure that all this passion and energy and funding is actually producing the result we want. So educational, when we get our entire culture in our organization around one common theme of, you know what, we want to transform lives. In order to do that, we have to learn, and we can't just come in with what we know and say, hey, what I know is enough, and I'm just going to do what I know. But instead, this continuous quality improvement says, what else do I need to learn in order to do my job better? How do I engage that learning that I'm encouraging my participants to do, but how do I also apply that to myself, to my job, and organizationally? And so we love that it just sparks a fire inside everyone we come in contact with, whether it's our employees, our staff, or whether the people we're serving, to really want to continue on this lifelong journey of learning. And so it is exciting. Yes, really. I hear a lot of people say, oh, gosh, Kathy, you know, oh, you're part of this study or that research. We've done some RCTs, right, which are painful. But it's also really exciting because it really helps us understand what is working, what we need to adjust or modify. But really, the things that are working and that comes to the surface are really powerful motivators and really inspire us to continue to get better, do better. Even if we're doing well, it's like, okay, what can we do to move that needle instead of just affecting 80%? Let's shoot for 85 or 90 or 95, right? And so when we look at our CQI process, the investment of our time and energy produces this huge return, because our staff only invest in the frontline facilitators, and as an average, only about 10% of their time. And that's in collecting data, reviewing the data, and participating in meetings. That's a really small investment for the huge return that we get from practicing CQI. So I want to share with you a little about our strategy. So we really look at how we do CQI is really team support. We look at it as, hey, how can we support our team to help them have the best results in serving people? Because that's our passion. Ultimately, we all are in this for one cause, one reason, and that's to transform lives, right? In order to make sure we're doing it right, we have to have a good staff, and that staff has to feel supported. So when they get regular feedback and we engage them in the process, they're more inspired to put forth their best effort. So we have a customized database that collects not just, so it's kind of layered if you think about it. So we've got our required performance measurements for our grant, and so all of that information goes into our database. But we also have the own questions that we have as an organization. Remember I said, we want to make sure that we're staying true to our vision and our mission. So we collect data that says, hey, you know what, are we moving the needle that we really have in our overall mission to build a legacy of strong families, to fortify youth and adults in ways that build a legacy and a solid platform for success? And so we have our own questions we want to answer. So we have that information in our database, as well as, hey, how are we measuring community impact, and what difference are we really making in our community as a whole, as well as in the individual lives? So our database is very robust. And all of our facilitators across projects use the same database, but they might be collecting slightly different information depending on the funding source, because remember, our number one was our required performance measures to report back to our funder. And so our time spent and cost involved, as I said before, like our return on investment is really huge, because for less than 10% of their time investment, the return on that investment is better outcomes, more effective and efficient programming, greater buy-in in the staff, which in turn makes them stay, right, being really committed and loyal to the mission because they feel valued and appreciated. And then we love trying new processes. So we use our data to inform is that product a good product? What's the deliverables? So we have our own proprietary programs that we implement. And so we're always going back and saying, how do we make that better? is this really producing the right outcome? And so we identify what it is we want to do and then describe it. So if you look at this wheel here, this continuous improvement, and so we describe, hey, this is really what we want to do, and we think that this will work. And then we analyze, okay, so why do we think this is going to work? How do we think it's going to work? And so then the next step in the process is now we test it. So we pilot it. We say, okay, we're going to work with a small group of youth or parents, and we're going to say, what kind of feedback are we getting? Is this really what we're looking for? And then if that test says, yeah, we might have to do some additional adjustments. We might have to go back to the identify before we actually implement. And so all those arrows, sometimes we say, okay, we're going to implement it on a broader level. We get there and we say, okay, now what did we learn? What did we learn? And I love what Harry said. Sometimes it's really surprising. I love surprises. I'm with you, Harry, because then it's like, wow, that's something I didn't even think about. And what a great application, and how, that just enriches our program. So let's see how we can incorporate that further. Or, wow, that's a surprise. I didn't expect that to happen. Maybe we shouldn't do that again, right? So after we learn, we revise, and then we go back to identifying what's the next thing that we need to improve. So we are super excited about it, and we continue always in our lifelong learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa and have Vanessa really walk through what exactly is our CQI process.
Thank you, Kathy. As Kathy described, we love CQI at the Ridge Project because we make it work for us. We see immediate progress, and it keeps us on track, and we're just using a really easy and effective way to document everything and pull data when we need it. So what I want to do now is take this down to a day-to-day application level from a data perspective. So first, each week I have our data manager update our weekly CQI report. She has a simple form showing our weekly data that's side by side next to our monthly and annual goals. She uses that same form every week, so it's really easy for her to just run a quick report from her database and update those numbers every week. She emails the form to our CQI team every Monday, and the report shows these goals right away for them in a quick at-a-glance table for each output. The outputs not only include, say, our students served or adults served, for whichever program we're on, but it also shows numbers for our sustainability efforts, our community involvement, and our evaluation activities. These activities may sound abstract and not what you expect to put on a numbers report, but we just keep it really simple and literally just list the number of meetings for each of those areas. And then in other internal reports in our data department, we have those documented and further defined. So of course, after these reports are looked at and everyone reviews them personally, we meet the very next day and have a weekly meeting. This is just a Microsoft Teams call that we do. It's really informal, but it gives us a chance to update the staff on what's going on with the project, as well as an opportunity to discuss any nuances we see from the emailed report. It also allows us to address issues almost immediately. This has really helped us keep on top of our numbers and really enabled us to reach our goals in time without having to scramble at the end, and also discuss other things like behaviors or feedback from surveys that we're getting from the students. So I think all of our staff has really grown to rely on these meetings. It keeps us in sync with each other, the project, and our stated goals. We follow these up with a strategic monthly CQI meeting. These are quite a bit more formal. We have a prepared agenda for the meeting, and we include a more detailed CQI report. I have our data manager prepare this detailed report, and it includes not only our real-time numbers, but projected numbers for the upcoming month and other goals that have been discussed in previous meetings. These meetings are supposed to be face-to-face, but of course, COVID has kind of changed that, and we are having these as a video meeting for now. But they're still really great to get to see everyone's faces, and they give staff members a chance to celebrate and congratulate each other on achieved goals, and then give us a chance to really get deep into discussions for areas that need improvement. We really see this time as when our staff feels incentivized because they see the monthly report, and it really shows the biggest changes And the monthly goals look way less intimidating than the initial logic model goals that just list our annual or overall project goals. Our staff also loves the camaraderie they get by discussing similar issues they've come across. It allows them to brainstorm for solutions that lead them to the next month, where they can celebrate the achievements together that were made due to the solutions that they had discussed in the previous month's meeting. And then something I didn't list on my slide here, but we also have meetings with our partners. Like many of you probably, we have other program providers that we partner with to deliver services. These monthly meetings every other week are face-to-face, and the other week we just do them over a conference call. Our partner CQI report looks a little bit different than what we use in-house. We just use percentages on the report instead of the actual numbers, since each contractor has different goals that they're working towards. Using a percentage keeps them all on the same page so that they all know that they're shooting for the same percentage for that month. In other words, say mid-year, that percentage should look like 60% of your year-end goal completed, or 50% of your year-end goal completed. And it keeps them unified and on the same page with each other. So for this next slide, I want to go backwards a little bit and emphasize that all of our goals are fully driven by our logic model. I know that's preached to grantees a lot, that we need to use our logic model to inform our projects, so we all know this, but it's so easy to ignore a logic model when we're working so hard on actually implementing the project. So the only way that we have found to keep that logic model alive throughout the year is our weekly CQI reports, because they're broken down from the initial, large number on our logic model into reachable monthly goals. We break down the logic model outputs and deliverables. We turn those into reachable seasonal goals that we place side by side with the overall goal to watch our progress. So for instance, if my total goal for the year is listed on my logic model as 1,200 students served annually, I'm going to break it down monthly to numbers I know from past projects that we routinely reach. So as you all know, you're going to have higher numbers during the school year in comparison to the summer. So our monthly school semester goals are going to be quite a bit higher than our summer monthly goals. And this sets the team up for success. They don't get discouraged when they see low numbers in the summer, and they know that they're still going to reach the overall stated goal. They also don't get discouraged by keeping the logic model as is in front of them, because the weekly reports have it broken down into easy to achieve monthly goals. And of course, the logic model also drives what data we choose to collect. For example, in the last slide, I talked about how we also track our sustainability efforts, our community involvement, and our evaluation activities. So we've created our online databases and data collection forms based on the logic model outputs. So we know that we're collecting all the data we need to inform our CQI to reach our logic model goals. And these CQI reports are also really beneficial when we're putting together year-end reports, because it's all right there broken down for us and easy to remember what we did for the year. So in this way, we use our logic model effectively to drive our projects on a weekly basis. And our team always knows what has to be done to complete the project in a way that really... So this is our basic format for implementing our CQI process on a data-driven level. We found it to be really easy, effective, and fun. So I'm going to pass this over to Kathy now to discuss the evolution of our CQI strategy. Back to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Vanessa. So I think it's important to note, so the Ridge Project is 20 years old. And so we didn't come into doing this with our projects, come into the level of sophistication and data collection that we have right now. Our system is very robust. It's very sophisticated, and it was developed over a course of years, right? And so our early focus when we very first started was basically like, okay, let's get these programs implemented, and let's just use the data for our funded reports. We've got these reports that are semi-annual or quarterly we've got to do, so let's just collect data so that we can be compliant, right? So all of our data collection in our early years was around compliance, right? Compulsory, not because we really wanted to. It's not because we really had a desire to collect data. We just had a desire to serve people, right, and to transform lives. And we didn't really have a love of CQI or a love of data, only that it was required. And so if we were going to get funding, we had to collect the data and report on it. So we shared the data at the reporting time, if you see there in that very first circle. And then we changed program only after failed attempts. So let's say we had semi-annual reports, we'd be collecting this data, but we really wouldn't bring all the data together until, okay, our semi-annual report is due in 30 days. We need to start crunching numbers so we're prepared to submit our semi-annual report. And at that time, we'd say, oh my, right? Oh, this is doing really well. That school or this district doesn't seem to be doing well. And so it was like, by the time we realized that things weren't working that well or that things were working really well, you know, we had to scramble to try to figure out why it was working and why it wasn't, right? And so then as we began, I guess, to mature a little bit, what's remained the same is that we've always collected data, that we've always shared data. We shared it with our partners, shared it with our key stakeholders, shared it with our staff, and that we always based our objectives on our logic model, and that we were always looking for ways to innovate. So those things remain the same from the time we started to now. But as we began to kind of mature and think more about, okay, this is stressful. We're finding out, 4 or 5 months later that something didn't work well. And so we're having these really rushed hallway conversations, or at our staff meeting, maybe we didn't get to spend as much time as we wanted because the pressure to actually get the numbers was greater than our desire to find out what was working and what wasn't. So we began to kind of have this balance happen where we started saying, hey, so we might be meeting the performance objectives for that funder, but do those performance objectives, is that enough to track for what we want as an organization? Because yes, we wouldn't even apply for the funding unless it aligned with what we wanted to achieve in our organization. But there might be more things, like let's say we really want to know high school graduation rates, or maybe we really want to know whether or not they're getting employed, and if they're getting employed, how well they're doing in their employment, right? And those are things that maybe aren't included in our funder because they don't really, that wasn't their design, right? So we started asking some additional questions and really kind of expanding our process. So we said, wow, we can even use our staff evaluations. We can use pre and post surveys. We can use satisfaction surveys for teachers, administrators, key stakeholders. Of course, our attendance records, and then break down our attendance records, okay, the enrollment, the completion, and, at what point, how many hours of the class do they have to take in order to actually have an effect that lasts across time. So we started getting a little more sophisticated. And so now we also began to implement real-time data to drive program implementation and improvement. So we can right now get a snapshot, like Vanessa talked about, those weekly reports. I love those weekly reports because that's what's happening right now. From last week to this week, this is what's happened. And so we can really quickly adjust course if we need to and say, hey, this is really doing fantastic. So let's do a cross organization or cross staff training to say, okay, why is this working well? Well, we found out because of this, so let's all implement it. So we collect data for CQI and funder requirements. So both of those are integrated. We share our data regularly. Instead of just waiting until we have our required reports, monthly we are sharing the data with all of our program partners so that they know what we're doing and how we're tracking. We process our data using our logic model outputs to quickly identify the issues before they become failed attempts. And I love that because it helps us be more effective, more efficient, and reach people in a much better way. It's like the people we serve deserve the absolute best. They deserve excellence. And in order to define what excellence is, we have to do this continuous quality improvement. And so anyway, our CQI process has evolved over the years. It's become more robust. Our system is very sophisticated and developed over time, and can now, as Vanessa said, easily, if there's something that we want to know, we ask her, and that day we get the data. When we very first started, if we wanted to know something, it would take us days of compiling data and figuring out, where the data was and how to get the data together in order to get the answer to the question we had. And so over time, we have gotten very good at kind of predictive data, like, okay, if this worked there, and so we can predict that this is going to work in this setting as well. And so that's one of the many reasons that we love CQI. So having finished up our presentation, I want to turn it back now to Lauren Murphy.
Thank you so much for those presentations. We're going to pause now for some Q&A time for the grantee teams. So you can use the Q&A widget and post questions, and I'll help moderate those to the grantee teams. And so as those are coming in, I did want to say thank you once again to Donna, Harry, Kathy, and Vanessa for sharing your presentations and your passion for CQI with us. So thank you again, and we'll pause now for some Q&A. We'll have time for some more questions at the end if we don't get to everything now. So once again, please use the Q&A widget, and we can pose those questions to the teams. Thank you. Not seeing anything yet. Give it one more moment, but otherwise I might pass the presentation over to Annie to give some talk about some additional supports, and we can always respond to questions at the end. But I'll just give it one more moment. All right, Annie, I'll pass it on to you, and we can go back to questions towards the end.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, we'll have another opportunity for questions if you need some time to think about it after a few slides that we have. So just wanted to pull out some of the key takeaways from the two teams. So some of the strong practices that I heard highlighted are communicating the importance of learning and improvement from the start of your program, broadly involving staff in the work, so both support and administrative as well as frontline staff. Setting aside regular time to examine data and learn and discuss, in addition to the ongoing nature of CQI work, having these regular times to reflect. Making data accessible and using it to motivate improvement. Proactively identifying areas for improvement rather than waiting until something becomes a major challenge. And then making sure to disseminate progress and learning with key stakeholders. So we wanted to spend some time highlighting best practices from the field and the literature and our work more generally with practitioners. And you'll see that a lot of what is highlighted as best practices aligns really well with the key takeaways that you heard from PATH and the RIDGE project. So we'll be referring back a lot. But there are really 4 levers for influence of learning culture. And those are leadership support for data and building a culture that's focused on learning. Having dedicated staff for carrying out the work to ensure there are people who have the time and commitment for engaging in the work. Developing a learning plan that outlines your process to make sure everyone's on the same page about the processes your program is going to use. And building staff capacity. So you need to ensure that both leadership and frontline staff have the capacity to be able to engage in improvement work as well. So we'll start with the first, which is leadership. And I think you heard this a lot from the 2 teams who presented before. But in order to truly build a culture centered on learning as opposed to compliance, for example, leadership needs to foster a culture of curiosity. So thinking about how to do better, sharing research from the field with everyone, and this is something that PATH highlighted in their presentation. A key part of being self-reflective as a program is soliciting suggestions from staff as well as participants about how to improve. So something like a staff survey or a suggestion box if that's something you're not already doing. And then it's also useful to foster, and this is something Lauren touched on at the beginning, but useful to foster a culture in which failure is seen not as something negative, but as something to learn from. So we talked in some of the prior webinars about road testing, which if you weren't on those, road testing is a method to pilot improvement strategies to see if they work before implementing them program-wide. And the point of doing that is that you start with something really small and low stakes, which allows you to try something new and innovative. And if it fails, that's okay because you didn't invest very much into it at the start. And you can learn from those failures. So that's a message. That message to try new things and to innovate and to learn from failure really has to come from leadership. Another thing leadership can do is just to ensure staff throughout the program are engaged in the work. And I think we heard this in both presentations as well. So sometimes that means using supports or incentives to encourage staff to be data-driven. So for instance, if your facilitator completes fidelity logs as part of their work, you don't just want them to fill out the logs, but you also want you want them to use what they're tracking, to look for trends, to think about how they can improve their delivery. So some tangible things that leaders could do to facilitate data use. One is just to set expectations to participate. So some programs will actually build data use and engagement in CQI work into their position descriptions. So it's clear from the start that learning from data is an expectation. And I know Pat talked a lot about how they set those expectations at the start of the program when facilitators are first onboarded. Rewarding data use is another strategy. So some programs will use tools like brag boards or celebrate strong data users to recognize good work from staff. The Ridge project spoke of how they share positive results to motivate staff to connect with data. So any way you can build internal or external motivation to use data and engage in improvement work is a benefit towards building a strong learning culture. So those are all ways to encourage data use. But beyond just using data to inform practices, there are a lot of opportunities to involve your frontline staff in CQI work more broadly, because it's not exclusively focused on using quantitative data. So if you have staff who have trouble engaging with data, you may look for opportunities for bringing them into your CQI process in other areas. And some of those natural places to bring in staff, if you were on our first webinar, we talked about the importance of investigating root causes when you identify a challenge, as well as broadly brainstorming solutions with your staff. And they can really inform those conversations because they're the ones who are on the ground doing the work. So you may already be soliciting opinions from your facilitators and other staff, but it's helpful to be explicit that they're engaging in and supporting the program's CQI process so that they can see their role in supporting improvement work for the program. So now we're going to do a chat because we realize that a lot of you may already be doing some of these things that we mentioned. So we're just interested to hear how you set expectations that staff in your program use data to inform their work. Or alternatively, do you have solutions or strategies to share with this group about how to do that well? So I'll give everyone some time. And for this one, if you could use the group chat, we'd like everybody to be able to see your responses. So what are some ways that you set expectations as staff use data? Anybody have strategies to share? Okay, well, we'll give people time to respond to that because we are still interested. And I also think it's helpful for others to see. Oh, we got some. So sharing results on a regular basis. Yep, it's always good. Sharing results, that's the expectation that they should be looking at it. Bringing back the data to show how it directly correlates to the program. Yes, absolutely. Relating it to their on-the-ground work is crucial. So making sure that data reflect everything we implement in our program. Definitely making sure that it's relevant to on-the-ground staff. Those are all great strategies. So I'm going to move ahead to our next lever for building a learning culture that we wanted to touch on, which is having dedicated staff to support improvement work. So in our first CQI webinar this summer, we talked about having a core team focused on program monitoring and CQI. And in that webinar, 57% of you said you don't currently have a core team, and I think a little over a third had an active team. So if you're among those that don't currently have a team, or maybe you had one but it's not active right now, you could just start by finding intentional ways to involve staff in more ad hoc ways. So like getting feedback through surveys, as we mentioned before, and then build towards having a more dedicated team in the future if that's something that you think could work for your program. So your core team are those who commit to carrying forward improvement work. They're the ones who meet maybe weekly, monthly, quarterly, look at data, identify challenges, investigate the root causes. They're the ones responsible for engaging other stakeholders in developing improvement strategies, and then also sharing progress with staff and lessons learned about strong practices. They're not the only ones who have input into this work, but they're the ones who commit to making sure it happens and leading the effort. So who is on the team? Of course, you're going to have your leadership and evaluation staff involved in the work. It's also a good idea, as I think you heard from some of the teams, to recruit one or two of your frontline staff to be on the team because they bring a different and useful perspective to the work. So as we just mentioned, you're likely going to want to involve all of your frontline staff in some way, asking for their feedback on improvement strategies, for example. But it's great to also have one or two who are actually going to commit to being on the team and engaging in the work regularly. Let's do one more chat. If you do have a dedicated team, how did you decide who to include on your team? Or what perspectives were you looking for when you were thinking about who to include on your CQI team? So beyond leadership and evaluation staff, for those of you who have a team, or for those of you who are thinking about having a team, who would you invite to be a part of that? Starting out small. Yes, that's definitely a good strategy. Oh, your organization is starting out small. I got you. So everyone on the project is on the CQI team. Yeah, and especially if you're a smaller program, that's a great approach. So yeah, it looks like a lot of you are saying you're a small team. So you either have everybody or you're careful about thinking about who. So 2 frontline people. That's great that you're involving frontline staff. Absolutely, data people are crucial to that conversation. All right, so I'm going to move along so that we don't run out of time. I didn't see this in the box, but this was a question that came up during our CQI webinar in June, so that we wanted to touch on it, and that's whether or not to have participants on your CQI team. So someone asked, is it appropriate to involve participants in your CQI work? And so involving participants in improvement work is something that really happens along a continuum. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So many of you are probably already involving participants in ad hoc ways. So that includes things like getting their feedback through surveys or focus groups or interviews. One step beyond that, which some of you may already do, is bringing data that you get back. So say you do a pre-post survey, you get those results and bring those back to youth, maybe in a focus group, or if you have a youth advisory council, bringing that to the young people to help get their input in interpreting the data. That's a really strong practice that can lead to improved insights. One step beyond that is actually deciding to invite 1 or 2 participants to join your CQI team. And some of the benefits to that, first is that it supports prioritizing work that provides value to participants. So even though you're already administering feedback surveys to get their thoughts, you're still really the ones who are driving the questions. So say you ask a lot of questions about whether they liked the facilitator or the curriculum, but the real issue for them was more related to logistics like time and place. So involving participants up front is an opportunity to allow young people to help not just to provide feedback, but to also give feedback on what the program needs to learn. So really driving the learning agenda along with staff. It's also an opportunity to build trust with young people, just being open with them that you're hoping to learn from them. And then lastly, as you're working to develop solutions to program challenges, if youth are involved, it's an opportunity to develop solutions that are informed by their lived experiences. So when you're thinking about who to bring on the team among participants, similar to staff, you want to recruit young people who are comfortable being open with negative feedback if they have it, feel comfortable contributing insights about their lived experiences, and then also have availability to commit to participating. Just curious then with this poll about how your programs have involved participants in your CQI process. And so our options here are A, that you haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. B, you engage participants as members of the improvement team, so what we just spoke to. C, you engage them in ad hoc ways, so we also spoke to doing things like satisfaction surveys or collecting their feedback for improvement via focus groups or interviews. And then D, you do something else. We'd be interested in hearing about that too. So I'm going to give about 30 seconds to see your responses to that poll. Okay, let's take a look at what we have so far. So about half of the teams are engaging youth in ad hoc ways. Just about 11% said they currently are engaging youth as members or participants as members of their CQI team. But that's great that so many of you are already finding ways to get feedback from young people to inform your program. And I'm actually going to skip this group chat just to make sure we get through all of the information. So the third key lever for building a learning culture is having a defined learning plan. This is a written plan that describes how you're going to collect and review data for learning, so outlining both your program monitoring and your CQI approach. So if you think about what you need to touch on in a plan, you can really divide it into these 4 quadrants that I have here. Define is what are the priority outcomes that you're going to track. Measure, how are you going to track them. Learn, how are you going to share the data, and improve. So what's your process for improving when you identify challenges or areas to improve? And the benefit of having a tangible plan is that it makes it really clear the roles and responsibilities that all staff have for supporting this work. And then more broadly, its existence is really a signal that as a program you value learning for improvement and you intend to dedicate the time and resources to support the work. So its purposes can be practical but also symbolic in that way. The define phase is really about specifying your priority outcomes. We touched on this in depth in our June webinar on logic models. You want to specify your key outcomes to help you determine what you need to track to learn about whether or not you're having success. So some of that may be things you're already tracking for performance measures, but there could also be other things that you track only for your own internal learning. So the questions are, have you developed a logic model to specify priority outcomes first? But then more importantly, are you using your logic model to guide what you need to track? So in the June webinar, about 50% of you said you used your logic model regularly to guide your work. And then the other thing is, have you set benchmarks for what success looks like so that you're able to assess whether or not you're achieving your target? So the second piece is measure, and that's about your data tracking plan, which we talked a lot about in our July Measuring for Improvement webinar. So what tools are you going to use to track each priority outcome and other data that's important for improvement work? So are you going to have specific surveys, or are you going to use an internal data system? You should also specify who's responsible for tracking and ensure that all staff are aware of their expectations, as well as a process for who's going to review the data for quality purposes. So as you know, data is only useful if it's accurate and complete. So quality control processes are really critical. And that's the type of information you would want to put in a plan so you ensure that these processes, both entering and reviewing data, get done, especially when you have staff turnover. And then learning is about sharing, how you share and learn from what you collect. So specifying who are you sharing data with and how. How often are you going to review priority outcomes? Who needs to see the information? How are you going to share it? So maybe that's through regular meetings or sharing reports, as you heard from PATH and Ridge Project. And then, so one helpful tool for being clear about your data sharing plan is to create something like what we have here, which is a stakeholder map. This just allows you to be explicit about who needs to see what data and at what points. So if you look at our first row there, if you can read it, we say we're going to share aggregated fidelity log data biweekly with facilitators via supervision sessions. And the reason we're doing that is to troubleshoot fidelity issues. So we'll quickly do this poll. Again, we recognize a lot of you are already sharing your data with key stakeholders. So just interested in hearing who currently do you share your data with. And this one is a check all they apply. So you can check as many of the responses there that apply to your program. And those are frontline staff, site partners, participants and families, community partners, and other. So I'll give a few moments to answer that. Okay, not to rush everybody, but just so we get through. So 100% share with frontline staff, which is great. And then the next biggest one is community partners. So 3/4 of you are sharing your data with community partners. So sharing progress that your program is making. Okay, so quickly we'll talk about the last step, which is the improve step. And this is often the most difficult step. So you can have all these structures in place to define your outcomes and track necessary data and review it. But if you don't specify processes for improvement, the solutions to your challenges aren't necessarily going to emerge just from looking at the data. This is something I know well from my work with a youth organization prior to Mathematica. We spent a really long time struggling with the improve step before we realized that our struggles were really stemming from the fact that we hadn't specified a process for how we were going to do it. So in terms of how we were going to investigate root causes, or how we would broadly involve staff in brainstorming solutions, or what is our process for piloting our strategies to see whether or not they're working. So those are all processes that we talked a lot about in prior CQI webinars this summer. So we link to those in the resource section if you want to revisit some of the various approaches that you can do, that you can use for going through these various steps. And then this last bullet is really important. So when you learn via the process about what works and strong practices, what's your process for implementing new practices and sharing lessons learned about what works program-wide? So do you incorporate what you're learning into professional development opportunities, or how do you manage changes to practices and ensure that staff are incorporating new approaches? So those are all things that you would want to lay out in a learning plan so that everyone in your program is aware of those processes. And then last lever really quickly is building staff capacity to engage in the work. So it's not a given that everyone's going to have the necessary skills already. And that doesn't just include frontline staff, but there are skills leaders should have too. So for leadership, some of those key skills that we touched on a bit already, knowing how to foster a culture of curiosity, also telling a data story. So you can see from our example the difference in comprehension between sharing raw data versus creating a more visually appealing chart if you're sharing that with staff or participants or community partners. So we have some resources on both of those bullets in our resources slide. And then lastly, for frontline staff, key skills are data literacy, so that's a big one, knowing how to read charts, understanding what an average is, so things like that. And then there are also foundational skills that are important for engaging improvement work. So things like what is CQI, or why do we do it, and what are logic models. So again, we covered a lot of this material in our early webinars, and those are all linked to in the resource section if you want to pull out any of those slides and share those more broadly with your staff. So we're going to close on a group chat. So I know you've heard from PATH and you've heard from Ridge Project, as well as some best practices that we pulled together. And one thing that we wanted to emphasize, which Kathy really touched on too in her presentation, is that there are a few programs who do all of these things. So building a learning culture is something that really happens over time by continuing to improve on things like how you use data or who you involve in the process. So the goal is, if you rate yourself low at the beginning of this webinar on a learning culture, not to try to emulate what an organization is doing that's been doing it for years, but instead to think about a few small steps that you can try and try to build from there. So our group chat for everybody to close out was, did you hear any ideas from any of the teams or any of the other pieces that inspired you to do something different to work towards building a stronger learning culture? So what are some things you might try? Sharing data and results more frequently. That's great. Yeah, that was definitely a big theme in both of the presentations. Creating a written plan. Great. Yeah, it's absolutely important to make sure people know their role in supporting the process of CQI. Weekly data collection meetings. And I want to catch that one. It was an idea from one of the teams, incorporating check-ins into our team meetings. What's working well and what didn't work. I think that's a great one too, because that's something. Those are questions that's easy for every staff to engage with. It doesn't have to be so data focused all the time. Just asking them to contribute their thoughts. Set up a CQI team. That's great to hear. Incentivizing for positive feedback trends. Great. So glad to hear that some of you have some thoughts about what you might bring back to your program. I do want to move on to questions and comments and other thoughts. If you do now have any questions for the grantee teams, or any questions that we can ask, that we can respond to as well. So Lauren, do you see questions in the Q&A?
Yes, sorry, I was muted there. Yes, we had some questions come in earlier about sharing templates for CQI plan, as well as possibly a template for the weekly update. So Kelly or Vanessa, do you want to touch on that, and if you work with templates, or if that's something you'd be able to share?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Vanessa answered in the chat box, but that's absolutely true. We would be happy to share our templates. And I'm not sure, do we send them maybe to you guys to send a template to people? And, you know, each template, so for us, we track performance measures against our grants, but we also then include internal organizational things. So we probably, you know, would say, insert your thing here. You know, whatever it is that they also would want to be tracking. So how should we share those? What's the best way to share?
Sure. If you want to share that with us, and then we could always, as someone comes to us with through the our help desk, we could always share those out. That works for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's what we'll do.
Great. And speaking of that, I will actually go on to share. Make sure everyone has our help desk email, and I want to touch on next steps in case while other questions are coming in through the Q&A widget. So once again, we're always available for additional support. You could email the help desk at sraeta@mathematica-mpr.com. We will have a upcoming office hours where we can discuss additional questions that might come through. Once again, these office hours are designed to help for you to bring questions to us, for us to be able to then answer anything you might think about. I know there's only so much time during a webinar to talk about questions, and sometimes you need that time to digest. So if there are not questions that are coming through now, you can always bring those during the office hours. I want to go back to the resources that Annie touched upon. So you'll be able to link to some of the resources you talked about building a learning culture. There are some links to talking about data literacy and telling a data story, so getting that data, so learning more about data and how to share that with your staff, as well as links to our previous webinars that are up on the SRAE website and a primer on road testing, so get some of those foundational concepts. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, but we'll give it another moment for that. I'll leave up the contact information on the slot on the screen. And ask when the next office hours are. And I think that is still being discussed, but you will receive an invitation for when that comes out. And before we close out, I would like to once again thank our grantee presenters from PATH and from the Ridge Project, Donna, Harry, Vanessa, and Kathy, for once again sharing your information with us and sharing with the other grantees. It's always, like we said, valuable to learn from one another. So this was one of those examples of how to learn from others. And so you are already on your steps to developing that learning culture by attending today and hearing from others. Keep the question box open a little bit longer, but I'm not seeing anything new coming in. Let me check the chat box in case anything comes in through there. Yay for templates. Indeed. Give an opportunity for anyone else on our line to say anything. I know we have Jessica Johnson, you're online, as well as Heather Zaveri, if there's anything else you'd like to add before we close out. If not, I would like to thank everyone for joining today.